some fun with a quick but in-depth introduction to Informed, a React-based form library. This form library is completely state-based, meaning you can use it with React Native or React DOM. By default, it comes with some inputs exported out of the box, but you can easily wrap your own with a use field hook to build your own custom inputs. So without further ado, let's get started. You can install with one command, npm install --save informed. It's a zero dependency library, so you don't have to depend on anything else. Right off the bat, we can see a couple things we can do. So first of all, like I said a second ago, it comes with some default inputs. So these are just DOM elements that happen to be already wrapped with the hook for you. You can also see we have this relevant component and a debug component, which we'll see in a second. So you can see we have an onSubmit that gets the data, which is the values of the form. We have our first input here. That input has name equals name. This is important because it uniquely identifies that value in the form state. A label and a placeholder. This is a native DOM attribute here. We have another input tracked by age. It's type number, i.e. another native DOM thing here. A label here, and this says it's required, age required. You can see we have a third one here where we have another name field to uniquely identify, and then we have a custom informed attribute called formatter, which we'll see what that does in a second. We have a select with an initial value. That's another informed attribute, and we have a checkbox, which is a Boolean field. It will either be true or false. We have a relevant field, and what's cool about this is we know we have a checkbox field that's tracked by the name married. So we have the form state here in this when function. So we can say when the form state's value is married is truthy, we want to render all the stuff in children, which in this case is we want to ask for the name of the spouse. And then finally a debug component and a submit button. So we look down, we can see that here's our name field rendered with our placeholder. If we type in our name here, you can see that that was tracked on the right. You can see the values is now model S and Joe. It's model S because we had an initial value inside of this select up here, so that was already there. There's values and masked values, which you won't see right away, but I'll get to those. And sometimes these differ because what is shown to the user is formatted differently than what is saved. So this would be what's shown to the user, and this is what will be saved to the form state. You can see that the name field is dirty, but the car field's not dirty because that was an initial value. The name field at one point was focused. If I blur out of that field, you can see that the touched field name is now true because we already touched that field and we blurred out of that field there. If I go ahead and tab out of that, you can see we have age required here, and you can see that our errors represents the error state of the form on the left there, tracked by the name field, and that validated because I blurred out of the field, which is the default. The default validation happens on blur and on submit, but I'll get into the validation stuff in a little bit. This phone number field, you can see if I type some random numbers here, it formatted, and it formatted like that because I passed in this formatter string. There's all sorts of cool things you can do with formatting. That just touches the surface of it. You can see because I had no parser function, which I'll get into, the values stored in values was the same as the values stored in masked values. If I click on that I'm married, you can see that all of a sudden married went to true, and because of that the relevance triggered, and now I can see the spouse field here. So I can go type foobar, right? And there we go. I can now see that I am tracked, spouse is foobar. If I click the uncheck to the married, that field is no longer relevant. So what do we expect to happen with the values? Well, you can see it cleaned up after itself. That value is no longer in the form state, which is a really cool thing about relevance. So you can put 20 inputs in here. The second it becomes irrelevant, they clean up after themselves. There's a code sandbox here. You can go play with it online. That's the same exact example you saw above. But that's all cool and everything, but you're going to be like, well, Joe, how do I build my own inputs? I have my own design system. I don't want to use your inputs. I have my own, error, styles that I'm going to use. Well, that's super easy because under the hood, all I'm basically doing is this. You build your own inputs using two hooks. There's use form and there's use field. So if we take a look at this, we can see that we have a native DOM form. I pass no validate because by default the browsers will attempt to perform their own validation when they get like variables like required on the DOM inputs, so we turn that off. We pass down any user props. This is things that that end up natively on a native DOM form input, so that's what that is spreading. And then we just take the form controller and we say, hey, I want onSubmit to call the form controller submit form. And then finally we just pass children. So that's our simple form. The next is you build your inputs. In this case I built 3 of them, or I think 4 actually. I built an input. This input is a label and an input. That's it. Dead simple. Nothing complicated. I call use field. I said it's type text, and I spread informed on there, and I hooked up the ID and the label off of the user props. So I made sure that the label didn't end up on the native input here, and I made sure that I mapped the IDs here, and then spread the rest of the props onto that input. The next one is a checkbox, and I don't need to get too into that. It's basically the same thing, but I said type equals checkbox. The third is the same as the first one. It's an input, but this time I wanted to get a little fancy with it. I wanted to use the fact that useField returns a field state, which has all of the field state properties on there. One of them being error, and one of them being show error. Show error is a Boolean that determines when and when not to show an error, and error is the actual error. And you can see in this case we wanted to add a style tag to our input, and also render a small tag with the actual error. There is a select, same thing, just wrapped with the use field. Now I've built 4 different fields. Let's go use them. So down below you're going to see the same exact form we just saw before, but this time it's with my inputs instead of the ones from above. And when I go down and I hit the submit button, you can see that the age field used the error input, and that's why it is styled the way that it is. And the reason that these still have some style to them is because I have a class, some style sheets in here to make them look nice. But if not, they would look like just dumb inputs. And you can basically see, if I go back up to the code sandbox, that these inputs also have styles. But if I were to remove the style sheet, then these would just be dumb inputs without style to them. So that's how you wrap your own. Once you do this, you never do it again, and you can take advantage of all of the cool attributes like formatter, initial values, and again, I'm just scratching the surface of the things you can do with those things. One thing I haven't talked about much is this debug component, which I'll get to in a little bit, but that's what's being rendered out on the right here. It's basically JSON stringifying the form state, but it's kind of useful if you want to see what's going on with your form. Here's an example of another property you can pass to inputs. So there's a validate function you can pass, which takes the value and as a second parameter values. And in this case, I'm saying if I don't have a value or the value's length is less than 5, then say the field must be at least 5 characters. So if I go ahead and I click submit here, the field must be at least 5 characters showed up. If I type 5 Ds, the second I type the 5th, you can see it's not validating right now because I don't have a validation on change prop, which I'll get into. It's validating on blur and on submit by default. If I blur, you can see it validated. So if I make it invalid until I blur, in this case, it's not going to show the error, but that's totally controllable. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Here's the form state. You can see that we have a bunch of things on that state I went over a little bit earlier. You can see the form is currently pristine. It's not dirty. It hasn't been submitted. If I go ahead and click submit, you can see it's been submitted because the form was not invalid. This field was not required. It's still pristine because I haven't actually interacted with it. If I go ahead and type some letters, you can see it became dirty. It is no longer pristine. That field is dirty. That field at one point had been focused. There's all sorts of information here that you can use to your advantage. You can access the form state in different ways. So one way, which you can see here, is, and actually this is actually supposed to say form state, so I'll update the documentation. But basically the debug component that I export is basically this. The debug component just calls use form state and JSON stringifies the form state in a pre and a code tag. So this is an example of if you need to access anything in the form state, you just call the hook and boom, you got it. You need to make sure you're in the context of the form, but that's it. If you need the state outside of the form, you can do that. There's an on change that gives you the form state for some reason you want to save it. Or if you need it outside, you have an API ref you can pass into the form. And this might actually be called form API ref or API ref when I actually do the release, so I'll make sure the documentation is correct by then. But basically you can get the ref, and you can see that I have this button, and when I handle the click event, I console log. I say, hey, API ref, which is a React ref, current, I say get state, give me the state, and I'll log it out. That's a good segue into the form API. So you can see in this case, I have this button here, and when I click it, it sets a random value to the first name field. How did I build that? Well, I have this random setter button that calls use form API, which comes from informed. I have an on-click event that calls form API.setValue, and it sets the name field to a random number. That's simple. There's my button down there. You can also access the API via a render prop like this, or function as a child, as some people call it. So for the forms, child is a render prop here. You can also access it via a ref. So this is probably the actual name I'm going to give it is form API ref instead of API ref, but you can see I did the same thing I did prior with the state, and I have a click event outside the form. This is outside the context of the form. I have a button with a handle click, and that will set the value. Finally, the last thing in the getting started section here is talking about the fact that Informed actually has schema and format based forms. And what do I mean by that? Well, I say that format based is JSX and the other one is JSON Schema. So for those of you who don't know, there is a standard out there for JSON Schema, and that is used to basically share information and validate information. And you can actually use that standard to render a form. So here are two of the exact same forms rendered out that you saw up above before. We have a name field, an age field, a phone field, and a select here. Here it is with JSX. If you're familiar with JSX, go ahead and use that. But sometimes, let's say you need to store your form in the database and render it on the screen, you can use a valid JSON schema, where the only thing that's not part of the JSON schema spec is this UI props. These are things that should end up on the DOM elements. Like formatter, for example, that's an informed prop. Placeholder is a native prop. And that will render out a form. You just say, hey, render some schema fields and a button here, and boom, you get yourself a form. And that is schema based, and there's a whole bunch of docs about schema down below. So let's go ahead and get into the state again. Let's just take a look one more time at these. We've seen these before. It's documented as to what is in the state. You can go read about these. I won't go into all the details right now. There's a bunch of API methods that you can do. You can set values, get values, manually validate, all sorts of things in here. There's props you can send down to the form, which I won't get into all the details right now, but there's a bunch of props you can send as well. Now let's talk about some cool stuff. So, what's the reason I want to use a form library? Well, I want to make it really easy and intuitive to build fields like this. So here's an example you saw before where I have a radio group with a yes and a no and a relevant, and when I hit yes, I can see the spouses field, and when I hit no, it's not. I showed you this example in the getting started. So that's an example where we use one of Inform's components to do a job we need to, which is hiding and showing a field and making it irrelevant. Well, what if I had one field that depended on another? So in this case, let's break this problem down a little bit. We have two fields. We have a radio to say I'm either buying a car or a truck. And then we have a product select. So right now I have car selected, and you can see my options are Model S, 3, X, and Y, right? So let's say I were to go and select Model 3, right? So let's take a look at the state here. So we have our form state, which says, okay, we have the type says it's car, and the product says they're going to buy a Model 3, right? The type state says we have a value that is a car and dirty, false, right? Because that haven't touched that field. It's the initial state was car, right? And then I have the product state, the state of the second field. It's Model 3 and it's currently dirty because I interacted with it. What happens when I hit truck? Well, what do we want to happen before we write any code? When I hit truck, technically what's supposed to happen is the options in the product field should no longer be cars, they should be trucks. So when I hit truck, we want that to occur. But in addition to that, the user already selected Model 3. Do we want the form state to have Model 3? No. So we want this field to be reset. So let's go ahead and click that. See, two things occurred there, right? Two things occurred there. First, we can see the value of the type field is now truck. We can see it's dirty because it's no longer the initial state. We can see the product state it now got reset because it was supposed to, right? It was no longer valid because we are buying a truck now. So we have new options, but we also don't want that to have a car. Now I can hit Cybertruck, right? So if I scroll down, let's go take a look at the code. So we import a form and a radio group and our select, just like we do on any other form. But it looks like we imported two hooks here. One is useFieldState and one is useFieldAPI. Here we have hard-coded our options. So that's just a simple hard code of these options for car and these options for truck. We have a car or truck field that's literally just a radio group tracked by the name type. Its initial value was car, and we have two values here. We have our product select here. This is where things get interesting. We call our two hooks. The first one is useFieldState. We say, give me the state of the type field. What is the type field? Well, that's this field. And why do I want that state? Well, I want to know what the value of that field is and whether or not it's dirty. And why do I want to know that? Well, when the value changes, I want to, and it's dirty, right? And I've interacted with it. I would like to reset the product field. Well, how do I reset the product field? Well, I get access to the product field's API, which has a reset on it. And what I do is anytime that changes, I reset it. In addition to that, I need to build new options, which I do in a memo here. Whenever the value changes of the type field, rebuild my options. And boom, I have my options, and I can reset my field. And then you render it out at the bottom. So that again just scratches the surface of things you can do. Let's talk about paths. So you notice that every single field has a required attribute called name. And name is the unique identifier that tracks what that field should be stored in the values. So a simple case with username, if I type foo here in the username, it says values.username. What if I said friends0? So I literally said friends0 in the string here. If I type foo there, you can see it's friends0. What about siblings.1? If I type foo there, it becomes the second element in the siblings. What about parents0s.name? Well, now we have parents0s, which is an object, has a name field. What about foos.bars, zeros.baz is 1? Let's go ahead and type foo. You can see foo.bars, baz is foo, which is the second element, i.e. the index 1. So you can see that just by passing the strings, we can do some really powerful form state manipulation here. Where does that come into a lot of play? Well, if you noticed, you might think really quickly, oh, I can track my state in arrays. Well, these are dumb arrays because they're fixed length, right? I can do friend0, 1, 2. What about dynamic arrays? Well, that's one of the most important and powerful features of Informed, is you can have something like this, where I have an array field. This is friend0, this is friends1. You have Joe and Jane, right? Each element is an object. It's tracked by two fields. If I add a couple e's here, you can see it's tracked in the state. If I remove the 0th element, it disappears, and Jane is now the first element, right? So I just made a highly dynamic form here with an array field. So let's go look at the code. I have a form, I have input and array field. I have initial values with my two friends. I pass those into the form because I know that my field is going to be tracked by the name friends. I have an array field. How do I know it's going to be tracked by the name friends? I say name equals friends, just like any other field. Here's where it gets fun. You get the add function here, so I hook up a button, add. Then I have array field items, and that gives me the remove, and it gives me the name. I render the name out here. I have my two inputs here. I track them by name and age. But notice how I said name and age here, and it happened to get tracked by friends0's name and friends1's name, right? Just by using an array field. Very simple code. You have these like almost nested forms here. And they work because these are all scoped to the field friends, right? So that's why they're tracked by friends up there. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. But in addition to doing these types of array fields, I can even do flat array fields, which not a lot of form libraries can actually do, where I can actually use the same array field, but in this case, just say name equals name, and now you can see each element is actually a field itself. It's not a nested object, right? So that's an example of a flat array field. You can read these talks yourself. I won't get into all the details, but basically array fields are broken up into two things, array field and array field items. And you have access to APIs like add, reset, swap, add with initial value. You have access to remove, reset, set value, reset field. You have access to some info about like the index. You have some state here. You have all sorts of data, and you can see all of that data tracked here. You could read these docs yourself. They go into in-depth examples and descriptions of what's going on with array fields and how you can use them. It makes it super, super simple to do. And you can do all sorts of things within an array field. You can have the dependent example we had before, it's inside an array field. In addition, you can have large array fields. So here's an example of an array field with, I believe, 1,000 fields, and you can see it rendered in about a second, and I can type in this field and it's super fast. Go find a form library that can do that with controlled inputs, and I can reset the form instantaneously. There's all sorts of things I can do with 1,000 fields rendered on the screen. So super, super efficient. I already dabbled and talked a little bit about custom inputs, so I won't go into those details. But here's an example of, actually I will quickly go into this because before I showed you how to spread informed to make a custom input. What if I want to actually hook it all up myself? So you can see we have a use field hook here. We're defining our custom input component. We call use field with props. And what do? We take out the field state, we take out the field API, our special render function, a ref, and some user props. Let's break this down. First, we're going to take value error and show error out of field state. What are we going to do with those things? We're going to take our native DOM input, and we're going to set value equal to some code right here, making sure that it's always like an empty string, so we have controlled inputs, and that's how you hook up the value. And then we show a small tag with some red style and an error condition, and we also add some style to the input itself in the error condition. So that's the state. What about the control? Well, all you need to do is hook up on change on blur and you're done, right? You got set value and set touch. That comes off the API. Like, how intuitive is that, right? And then everything else is like, well, okay, label's not a native DOM thing, so let's just make sure we take that off, and we're going to render it here. We want to take the ID off because we want to set up the ID from the label to the input. Then we're going to take the rest. What's the rest going to do? Well, that ends up here. That's things like placeholder. Like any sort of native DOM or React Native things that need to end up on the input, you throw it on there. And now we've made our custom input. You can see we render our custom input down here. The docs are out of date. That should actually say custom input, so I will update that as well. And the about it gets easier thing is me talking about spreading informed, right? So that's doing the same thing. These docs are up to date. You can see custom input, custom input. So, and endless possibilities. Here I built a range slider. Look at that. And the range slider was basically hooking up those same on blur on changes to an input with type equals range. Ta-da. So that's custom inputs. You do that once, you never have to do it again. Let's talk about validation. So we have simple validation here. So this is the case where I'm going to go ahead and click the submit button here. And you can see the field must be at least 5 characters, right? And it happened because I clicked the submit button. Well, if we look, we have our validation function that we passed to each one of those fields, and it got triggered. So if I fill in, a couple values here, a couple values here, a couple values there, and blur by default triggers validation. Blur by default. We now have a valid form, right? It's valid true, right? If I backspace and I blur, you can see validation triggered. It's no longer valid, right? If I try to submit right now, it's not going to submit. It should window.alert, right? If I fill this in and then submit, you can see that it window.alerted me because the form is now valid, right? So it actually will not call your on submit unless you have a valid form. This is super cool. You have async validation. So here's an example where you can actually type in, let's go ahead and type in like, I believe a username that's taken, let's type in like one letter and hit submit, right? So that's valid, right? That's an absolute valid thing. But let's go ahead and try and submit without anything. Okay, username is required. That's synchronous validation. But then if I go down and look at the code to remind myself, looks like Joe is a taken username. So let's go ahead and type in Joe. Let's blur out of the field. We can see that it's validating, and we can see that it validated for about 2 seconds, and then it said, okay, we have an error. That username is taken, right? Let me go ahead and submit again and just watch. Validating 1, submitting true. So we can see that as we're validating that single field, we know that it's validating. The form is in a state of load, if you will, and when it's done, it will either submit the form if it decides that username is not taken, or it will not submit the form and then give you your error message here. By the way, this has built-in cancellations. You don't have to worry about, like, oh, let's say I want to validate on change as the user types. It'll by default cancel that stuff, so you don't have duplicate requests going out the back end and outdated information. So if I scroll down, how did I do that? Well, I have an input with a synchronous validate function. That's just, we've seen this before. It says username is a required field. And an async validate function, which is just returning a promise with a set timeout. In one case, it calls resolve with a string. Another case, it calls reject with an error. The third, it calls resolve with nothing. So you can think that if I do this and I type reject, that's the case where I'm going to go ahead and hit submit. And you can see it's validating. And you can see that it was unable to validate the username because I have code here that says unable to validate the username. That's simulating a 500 response or something. But if I type something that's not taken, it'll come back and it will resolve and all will be right with the world. So that is asynchronous validation, super powerful. You can do it in multi-step forms, which I haven't even gotten into yet. Super, super cool. Let's see, this is an example of, I won't get into the details here, but there's complex validation where you can have fields that depend on each other. So in this case, the second parameter to the validation function is values. So I can do things like type Joe on this field, must be at least 5 characters. Let's do Joseph, my actual name. Let's take that and let's put it here. So now we're good, but the field must be unique, and that's because we have access to all the fields. So we can check that, right? This is the bread and butter of validation. So because you have synchronous and asynchronous validation, you might need to validate at different points in time. By default, we see the X here, it's blur blur. Both synchronous and asynchronous validation will occur on blur. But you can pass validate on prop to each individual input or even the form to make it the default for all fields. And you can control when you want certain things to happen. So this is like a truth table. It says, okay, if I pass in blur blur or blur, which is blur blur, right, derived, like actually this is synchronous and asynchronous, it will do nothing on change, and it will synchronously and asynchronously happen on blur. What if I did change blur? Well, that would basically end up having synchronous validation on change, and synchronous and asynchronous validation on blur, and both on submit, right? So you can read this truth table and understand when you want. This is kind of like, you know, how Apollo's got fetch policies, right? You pass in a string and it represents a certain state of the world. In addition to that, you might want it to actually perform validation, but you might not actually want to show it. So maybe the form state can actually have an error, but you don't want to show the error. So you actually have 3 different props. You can say show error if touch, show error if dirty, to control when you want to show the error, right? In addition, you can pass a Boolean validate mount to trigger it manually. Those are tables. That's not very ingestible. Let's go look at examples, right? So if we look at this, we can see validate on blur is the default, right, on this guy, right? So if I go hidden here and I go ahead and blur out of there, you can see it was required, right? And then I type the letter, it must be at least 5 characters, right? So as I change, notice how as I change, when I go to 5 characters, it's not validating, right? It's not validating. But when I blur, it validates. The second one's on change. So let's go ahead and, backspace, and let's go ahead and, let's type in here. Let's actually refresh because I want to show something off important here that I missed as I typed there. So what I'm going to do here is this is validate on change. You're going to say, hey Joe, why am I not seeing an error here, right? Why am I not seeing an error? Well, I am, right? Username 2 has this field as required, right? We see it here. But until I blurred, it didn't actually show it. Let me refresh so you can see that again. So ignore these 2 fields. You can see that the username 2 does not have a required property on there, right? You can see it does not have any sort of error here, nor is it shown to the user. But I'm going to go ahead and type the letter D and then backspace it. Well, it's required, and it needs to have 5 characters, but it's not showing me. It's not showing me the user, but the form state has it. That's because this is validate on change, and by default, if we look here, show error if touched is the default flag. So until I actually blur and that field becomes touched, it won't actually show the error. The next one's different. The next one has validate on change, so I'm going to go ahead and type the letter D, and boom, instantaneously, we can see the error showing up. And when I backspace, you can see it changes instantly. Why? Because it's validate on change and show error if dirty, and this field is in fact dirty. This is change blur, so this is going to be an example where synchronous validation happens on change and async happens on blur. You could go down all these. I won't open up all of them right now because that's a lot to go over, but this last one's validate on mount. And this, you notice, let me refresh the form, we can see that both of those fields validated on mount because they both had validate on mount. So they're both in an error state in the form. But the show error prop is only true in one of them because this one has show error if error. If we go look at the code, let's go look at those guys. This one has show error if error. This one does not. They both have validate on mount, so they both validate on mount. So you have lots of control over when you want things to validate. By default, you can pass in required just flat out, and if I go ahead and scroll down and hit the submit button, you can see that all those fields turn to required. You can pass in things like patterns, mins, and maxes. It'll do the same thing. Whether you're using schema or format, it'll work in both of those cases. You can pass in custom validation messages. So in this case, I have an example where I have a custom error message for the required. This field is required for your profile. So you can see it says this field is required for your profile. But the other two are different because this is a form level required property. This is, I said, error message at the input level. And here I'm saying I only want the required message to be that. So you can control it at the field level. You can do the default error message. You can control it at the form level. The field level takes precedence. It's highly configurable. Highly configurable for validation messages. And then there's a schema version of that as well, which I won't get into all the details, but you can do that in JSON Schema. By the way, this is valid JSON Schema. There's paired validation, so password confirm password. Well, let's say I hit submit. All right, they must be at least 5 characters. Let's go ahead and type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, they must match. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Boom. Why did that happen? Why did both of those get validated at the same time? Well, it happened because if I go down and look at this, I have some validation functions. I want it to validate on change here, and then I have this validate when. I can basically teach these inputs to say, hey, password field, whenever confirm password field changes, please validate, right? Please validate. And because of that, I've basically hooked these two fields together such that that we make sure that no matter what, when one validates, the other does. We have built-in support for yup validation. You can create a yup schema and pass that in. You can do field level yup validation. So here's a text field with validation from yup. There's JSON schema validation and rendering. So this is actually using JSON schema validation to validate this form and rendering the form with just a schema. So here's a schema. We're using AJV to validate it, which is an open source schema validation library. And we are literally just passing in the schema, and boom, we have a full form here. We have only JSON schema validation. So this is an example where I render a form myself, and I pass in a valid JSON schema to perform the validation. So how freaking cool is that? Pretty awesome. There's a whole bunch of stuff with schemas. You can have a basic schema. You can have nested schemas where you have, this is a name and you have properties brother, and when I hit submit, you can see when I track these values, you can see that's an age field. So you can see that it's tracked under the brother namespace, where this is like, not tracked under brother, right? You have formatted schemas where you can still render JSX and render schemas. You have array fields inside of schemas. You have conditional schemas. You have conditional schema control. You have conditional options like that car truck example. You can do that with schemas. You can create your own custom fields for your own custom schemas. You can even render your own custom inputs inside of schemas. So in this case, I rendered some elements that have purple around them. You have nested array fields, relevant array fields, all sorts of crazy things. You can do everything you can do in format-based, you can do in schema-based. Debugging, you can use the debugging components I've showed you before. There's a debug and debug field to do debugging. That's what's being rendered here. So when I go ahead and click, Joe is my name, you can see here's the state of the field. The value is Joe. The mask value is Joe. Touched is true. Pristine is false. Dirty, true. Show error is false. There's no error in this case, right? But this is the form state, so I can track all the things. You can see all that stuff is tracked under the name field. There's formatting. So by default, you can pass a mask function. A mask function can be a string. A mask function can be an array of regular expressions or characters. There's some examples and some descriptions on how to do that here. And then you can actually type in this field and see that it's going to add the formatting for me as I type. Then, in addition, there's also a parser. So let's take a look at this phone number field here. Let's go ahead and type in that phone number field. Let's take a look. All right, we formatted with the dashes and the +1. But what's shown to the user is not what's stored in the form values. It actually stored it without any of that junk. Why? Because we actually passed in a parser function to that input. So if we look and we can see this input has a parser and a formatter. This input just has a formatter. So you can see you can actually parse it and have differences between values and masked values. It comes built in with a default number formatter that uses the INTL spec under the hood. So you can see that if I type a number for the Netherlands, it's formatted for the Netherlands. And it's because it's a locale based, you can do different locales based on this and also the currency, because this happens to be a currency formatter. Let's go take a look at that. Which, by the way, the value is stored like this and the mask is stored like this. How did we do that? Well, we basically built this little selector. We used a create INTL number formatter, which comes from utils, which comes from informed, and we passed in a locale. We said it's currency, and what currency is it, and what's the locale, and boom, you get a formatted thing for you. You don't have to do any work. You just say, hey, I'm gonna pass in that formatter, and I'm done right here. And in addition to that, you're going to be like, well, what's this thing, Joe? Well, this thing says, hey, because this example has a locale and currency selector, we need to make sure when this changes, it reformats the currency. So you basically say, hey, make sure that whenever the locale or the currency changes, you reformat, because otherwise it will only happen when you type. You can also do formatter functions. In this case, I passed a uppercase function in these locations because I want that function to execute, so that's why it uppercases these letters. All sorts of cool things you can do with formatting. There are hooks. So I've showed you a little bit these before. You can call use form API, get access to the form API, use form state, render the form state. Use field API. I can get access to an API for the name field. I can get access to the state of just the name field. So here's a component using the field state. So if I go ahead and type in here, you can see Joe. If I type, you can actually see that this one's using the name and it's re-rendering. That's that random number. But because this library is designed to be highly efficient, this field is not re-rendering because it's not changing. It's the age field, right? So you can see we have a component using the name state and the age state. You can see that example. There's use form and there's use field, and that's how you make custom inputs. So that's all sorts of cool things with hooks. There's multi-step forms. I won't even get into all the details, but there's crazy things you can do with multi-step forms to make sure that you don't proceed to the next step when these fields are required. There's a gotcha section to talk about initial versus default values. There's a difference. Changing initial values when you have dynamic forms, maybe you're loading something from a query. Initialize if pristine. Sometimes you want to have unique cases where you only want to initialize when you're pristine. That happens when you have things like relevance. There's scoping. In this case, there's some gotchas with scoping that I won't get into the weeds of. Then there's dynamic forms, which I won't also get into all the details of here. And it goes on and on and on, the cool things you can do with this library. So with that, that's my in-depth introduction to all the different features of this library. I hope you download it. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any issues with it, let me know. It's highly tested. Yeah, have a lot of fun, guys.